Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone to And She Thrived, which serves to hold space for Muslim divorced women. We are very honored today to have Shaykh Jabir Tarin with us from the Bay Area, California. Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. How are you today?
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing well. It's a pleasure to be here with you all.
Thank you. So I'm going to begin with a bit about his background. Shaykh Jabir Tarin is a registered associate marriage and family therapist. He has served as a teacher at several Islamic institutions, including Dua Seminary, where he teaches the Islamic Sciences, and Nur Institute. Shaykh Jabir has previously served as a therapist and spiritual and religious leader through the Muslim Mental Health Initiative at UC Berkeley and served the greater community through the Khalil Center. Currently, he passionately maintains similar roles through Wasilah Connections. Shaykh Jabir's professional interests include providing mental well-being and spiritual direction to the City of Fremont, integrating Islamic spirituality with mental illness, and teaching Islamic theology to young adults and college students. So much needed and such good work, mashallah. So my first question would be that what is it that inspired you to do this kind of work with divorcees specifically? Because you are connected with the Wasilah Connection. We have already interviewed Sunnah from Wasilah. So what is it that motivates you to do this work with divorcees?
Yeah, so alhamdulillah, actually the idea or the story behind me getting into this particular category of our community originally actually goes back further to why I got into the field of mental health in the first place. And the short and sweet version of that story is in one particular year when I was an undergrad in university, I had a good group of friends who all somehow, subhanAllah, all got married in the same year. And it wasn't really planned or anything like that, but they all got married in the same year. And by the end of that same year, about 5 or 6 of them all got divorced as well. So my actual journey originally sort of started with that because these were people who I loved dearly. They were my very close friends. And I was incredibly happy for them when they got married and totally devastated when by the end of the same year, within the same year, 4, 5, 6 of them all got divorced. So that piqued my interest, and it sort of started from there, my journey into mental health and particularly marriage and family therapy. My work started with a few different organizations, namely Khalil Center, where I was able to sort of start that education and get that training. But then really switched over to Wasilah because of the local grassroots effort that was being done, specifically working with the divorce population, but also the family unit and working closely with the families. And it was just the next stage in my personal growth and development, which is working with that population. And it's very much continued that line of interest of mine that I had from the beginning in undergrad. And it's a continuation of that even till now.
Wow, incredible. MashaAllah, may Allah bless this work. So as you, I'm sure, are well aware that in many cultures, there still are really a lot of negative stigmas attached to divorcees, in particular divorced women. And from what we've seen, divorced men do not really have that stigma. I'm not saying it's less difficult for them, because I think divorce is difficult for anyone. Would you be able to draw on from our religious tradition framing this erroneous perspective towards divorce in general?
Certainly. I think first and foremost, I think that culture plays a significant role in our lives, in marriages, in our funerals, in every stage of our lives, all the major ones, all the smaller ones. Culture plays a role in everything. And I don't want to sound like a person who just bashes on culture and practice and tradition, but I'll say that at times there becomes this type of enmeshment, and this enmeshment between culture and religion. They become synonymous. They become the one and the same thing, and people view them that way. And at that point is when it starts to become maladaptive and no longer helpful. And the reason for that is because when something happens culturally, I would say traditionally was very clearly defined. And oftentimes it has its own role in life, in marriage. For example, a person gets married. So out of respect in their family and their culture, they serve their in-laws, they live with their parents. There are certain cultural practices that people used to traditionally engage in. And for example, there will be benefit in their family, in their village, in the greater community. As things have shifted, we live in a global village. People have moved all over the world. We live in the West. Things are very, very different. And the role of culture, while still important, is no longer the same or as effective, at least in my experience, when it comes to sort of those traditional values or those traditional roles directly as it relates to the Islamic sort of guidelines or practices. And that enmeshment actually tends to cause more conflict than it does kind of like helping the greater good. And I don't want to get the wording sort of to offend anybody or to upset anybody, but the idea being that it's much easier to define culture and religion separately, and it's more effective for the individual or for the couple than it would be, for example, historically or traditionally. That being said, I would say that the concept of divorce and the taboos associated with divorce, if we look to the best of examples in the life of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, in the life of the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum, at least just right off the bat, one of the stories that come to my mind right away are, you know, the stories of Mughith and Barira radiallahu ta'ala anhuma. And their story is quite famous, but essentially the story is that they were slaves and they had got married in bondage in their slavery. And Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha felt pity on Barira, and so she freed her. And when she freed her, she had the choice. And as we understand in our Islamic law, that slaves, when they are freed, have the choice to remain in the marriage or to leave the marriage. And so Barira chose to be free from Mughith, and she chose to remain independent from him. And it's very interesting to note here that they had a child as well. They did have a child, and yet Barira still chose her independence. And the story or the hadith ultimately mentions that the Prophet ﷺ saw this scenario, this scene where Mughith was following Barira sorrowfully in tears, crying over her, and she was completely just unconcerned with him following her around, crying. So the Prophet ﷺ, you know, he asked her and he says, "Oh, Barira, would you consider taking him back?" And this is the point that's really interesting and important, I think, for us to observe and to kind of explore here. She said, "Are you commanding me to take him back, or are you just suggesting?" So he says, "I'm just an intercessor. I'm just suggesting. You know, I'm looking at his situation. I'm taking pity on him, that if you would take him back." So she says, "I have no need for him." She used very emphatic language. "I have no need for him." And that's how it was decided. And ultimately, despite having a child, which again, add to the cultural taboos, right? You have a child, do it for the children, etc. And by no means am I necessarily advocating for the proliferation of divorce. I mean, that's something nobody would want. The idea is we all get married to stay married. Generally speaking, everybody gets married to stay married. But again, it's important to understand, where necessary, here is how we should view the concept of divorce, which is that despite having a child, despite seeing his pitiful state of Mughith, Barira ultimately decided that she wanted to remain separate, and she lived that way. She ultimately lived that way. So the takeaway from this is that certainly there are, you know, cultural taboos that exist, but I think from our own Islamic tradition, if we decide to emphasize our lives and structure our lives in such a way that reflects more on the prophetic angle of things, I think there are plentiful examples for us to explore and to identify that there was never an issue with a woman being divorced and then remarrying, with a woman being divorced, and in this particular case with a child even. That really didn't seem, there seems to not be taboo mentioned in this regard. And there is one famous incident where the Sahabi Jabir ibn Abdullah, he got married to a woman who had been previously married. And so the only, not really even an objection, but the only comment that the Prophet ﷺ made was, "Oh, Jabir, why did you not marry someone who was unmarried like yourself? That experience would have been new for both of you. It would have been more exciting for both of you." And then he had his rationale behind it. He said, "Well, I have a lot of sisters and I have a big family and I need someone who knows, who can support me in that." And the Prophet was happy with his decision ultimately. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but I hope that gave a little bit of insight to the question.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's important to highlight these ahadith because to change cultural norms, it takes time. And what I also find fascinating is how in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there'd be women who would be in their iddah period, and the next spouse would already be promised and intended. So they would just finish the iddah period, and already right afterwards there'd be another marriage, and that is so very rare in our times. I'm not saying that that's the best thing to do, because maybe in this day and age people need to go for counseling, and there might be like some trauma involved or something. But it's just interesting to see that these kind of like judgmental attitudes that we might espouse are not from our tradition. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Now, I believe that you run a workshop called the Etiquettes of Divorce. Would you like to just tell us a bit about that, what that workshop's about?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was, subhanAllah, just because this is one of those topics where so much can be said, so much needs to be said, so much clarification is required. I felt like at a certain point in my life, I was receiving tons of inquiries about people in their specific situation, just having total confusion about a plethora of topics associated to divorce. Topics related to how many statements of talaq count as an official talaq, and just an understanding of what does a civil divorce look like, and what does an Islamic divorce look like, and there was just so many questions. I thought, okay, let's run a workshop on this, and let's try to approach this from the Hanafi point of view, regarding what divorce looks like and from legal text. And so we put together this workshop, and mashallah, it was quite a few people in attendance. And so we tried to put a presentation together for everyone so that it was both informational but also transformative, in the sense that it gave people the idea, or sort of the understanding of acknowledging, what does it look like? What does the process of divorce look like? What to expect beforehand? What mindset should one carry? And what happens when the actual physical divorce takes place? Many people were unaware of the idea of offering a single divorce as opposed to 3 divorces in back to back. This was something which was new to many people, actually. Another person had mentioned, just before the workshop, that my husband has said to me 1,000 times divorce already, and yet we still live together, and everything is as it is. So there's so much confusion that exists, and so much education that's necessary to have had. I thought that it might facilitate good discussion and awareness had we had a workshop. So in any case, the workshop, mashallah, was a success, and there's a tremendous amount of demand for it nationwide. And so inshallah, the idea is to continue to provide these educational seminars and workshops, so the community has a taste of sort of specifically targeting the category of divorce, what to expect, what to anticipate, what it looks like, and then the stages of it as well. And the other idea is also that oftentimes people have a misunderstanding of divorce, that it's like somehow the like the magic pill, like once you get a divorce, everything will be right forever, you'll be fine, you'll be good forever, and that's all. I just need that. I think that's all I need. If I take that, my life will be perfect. The reality is, the data suggests that's not the case. Divorced people go through a tremendous amount of grief and sadness and hardship and challenges. And so it requires so much more additional support from our family members, from our loved ones, from our communities, our masajid, our scholars, everyone. It's a team effort.
Absolutely. So are you able to, from your experience, tell us where do you see that there's the most lack of etiquette, and why? And how do you think that this could be prevented or remedied? So you did mention there's a widespread ignorance, it sounds like, but
Right.
anything else you want to add to that? Where do you see these pitfalls, most areas of lack of etiquette?
Yeah, I would say largely it's education. The reality is that everything goes back to education. And without sounding like a broken record, the reality is I think if a lot of people knew what they were getting into before they got married, this conversation is way before the topic of divorce. Before you even get married, do you even know what that means? Do you know what the rights and responsibilities are? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a husband and a wife and a provider and a caretaker? These are very big questions that I feel oftentimes we gloss over to just get to the wedding, to just get to the date of the nikah. And that's what we tend to see. We see the age. Oh, I'm 30. Oh, I'm 28. Oh, I'm 35. We see that number and we're thinking impulsively, let's get married. And so many things in the middle, the actual real important things are missed. They're missed in terms of responsibilities. What do I bring to the table? What do I promise to provide? If I'm going to be a housewife, how am I going to be a housewife? What does that look like? If we're going to be a dual income earning home, what does that look like? How will we share responsibilities? There are so many additional areas that need to be addressed before a person jumps into a marriage. But then, of course, add to that the layer of you come from a dysfunctional home, you come from a broken home, you come from a background of trauma, and then you carry that into the marriage and you never learn how to manage that or to deal with that. So then as a result, it starts to seep into your marriage. And then now the other person who may unknowingly marry you with all of this internal strife that you carry doesn't know how to best serve you or to support you. And so then there becomes a tremendous amount of turmoil in the marriage. And unfortunately, this can manifest in thousands of different ways. It turns into physical abuse, domestic abuse. It turns into sort of resentment and hatred and animosity and conflict with children taking sides, etc. But it's hard to pinpoint one particular pitfall that most marriages, fall into. I would largely say education is something that we all need. And I think even those who have been married for a while, there's no harm in having these reminder sessions where we have scholars speaking about this, therapists having workshops about this, the Jummah khutbahs, working with our scholarship, working with our ulama, not to look down on our Islamic leaders and our community leaders just because they're not therapists, just because they're not psychiatrists, but the reality is our Islamic tradition laid out everything before. And I feel like I can say this because I wear both hats. I'm a therapist and a religious scholar. So I feel like I can say this, that I think the reality is that it's not something for us to bash on scholars and say, oh, scholars aren't therapists. That's fine. But the Prophet ﷺ taught us how to be human beings before therapists were therapists. So I think that there's something to be said about working in tandem with our medical professionals, our therapists and psychiatrists, as well as with our scholars, to learn what's the best way to have a loving relationship.
Right. And also not all therapists are the same. Like, for example, I have been to a couple of non-Muslim therapists, and I just found that the level of conversation, it was very spiritually unsophisticated. It was pretty shallow because the whole cognitive frame, the whole paradigm of the metaphysical perspective Absolutely. Of who we are, is not there. And going with that, it also doesn't mean that necessarily every Muslim counselor is going to be spiritually sophisticated. Absolutely. So if I understand you correctly, it's like, be careful, take from a big web of people who can support you and provide knowledge, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's most necessary is to understand the framework by which we live our lives by. And if that's going to be obviously from an Islamic point of view, then we need to educate ourselves on what that means. We need to make our marriages more prophetic in nature. We need to do things for God's sake, not for goodness sake. My teacher, Sheikh Hashim, Hafidhahullah, he says this often, and he says, we need to paradigm invert the way we view the world. We need to essentially do things for God's sake. And if you're going to do things, and one of the things we talk about in the premarital workshop is having a God compass, which is you do things in your marriage for the sake of Allah, not just for the other person or not just for fulfilling a responsibility, but you do it, you fulfill a responsibility ultimately for the sake of Allah, so that if a responsibility that was supposed to be done for you is missed, you can forgive the person and say, I'll seek my right from Allah. And the idea is that when both people work towards this, mutual goal of doing things to please Allah in their marriages, then oftentimes you find that it's very easy to reset and reconnect and reconvene. So again, a lot to be said, but again, I think if I were to highlight one, it would be education and how necessary it is.
Okay, so I know you obviously can't go through everything in the workshop in this interview, and I highly suggest everyone attends this workshop. Are you able to, as much as possible, give us certain salient points from the workshop that we could learn from. For example, you mentioned the very important one, that one utterance of divorce is completely valid, and that's the Sunnah. And to do three utterances of divorces in one sitting is a bid'ah. It's an innovation, and it's really not recommended. Anything that you could add, as much as possible, very useful.
Yeah, I mean, this has been the recommendation of scholars, I would imagine, since forever, that follow the Sunnah. And the Sunnah is to offer a one single utterance of the divorce if and when that is the case, and that's what's been decided upon. Doing so in a state of the woman's purity, doing so in a state where your mind is objectively clear of anything else, and that you're not being sort of making an irrational emotional decision. And the idea is that, look, one divorce is totally sufficient to cause the separation. The utterance of I divorce you. That is sufficient for the divorce to take place. It's sufficient for allowing time if you want to reconvene, reconcile, right? Many a times we'd be surprised how many people receive the irrevocable divorce and the marriage is completely ended, only to sort of later reflect and say, you know what, I think we could have made it work. This also happens, right? This also happens. It's not something that we should be sort of oblivious to. The reality is that if you offer one divorce, the divorce takes place. You can't be with your wife, and it gives you time, for that woman to go through her, her period, her iddat period, and to, at least for you to decide what you want to do next. And if you ultimately allow that the timer runs out, then the timer runs out. But then that's it. And then if you were to come back together, then at least the door is open to do so. But the unfortunate reality is that, and I really actually maybe should look into this, but the idea of where it came to offer 3 divorces at one time, like sort of consecutively and on the spot, whenever you've made that decision, this is both something which in the books of law, it's mentioned as like very disliked, not according to the Sunnah. It's not something a person should do. Now it's still valid, but it doesn't, but it's not done in the best way. I don't know where that honestly originated from, but again, this is one of the things that we talk about is that you don't need to offer so many divorces. And even if you've made up your mind, even if you've absolutely agreed, both of you, that this marriage is not going to work, offer one divorce. It's completely fine.
And there's no need for another one.
There's absolutely no need to
Why
go to
you pull 3 bullets at one time?
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the reality is that, subhanAllah, imagine how many people utter the divorce out of anger. How many people do so because they're overwhelmed, they're flustered, maybe they experienced something, maybe they misunderstood something. So, okay, they said it once. Now look at the 2 scenarios. A person during his, frustration and state of, flustered mind utters a divorce one time. And in his utterance once, he, is so frustrated, he leaves, takes 3-4 days. And during that period of time, his people speak to him. In the Quran, of course, there's an ayat that mentions that وَالصُّلْحُ خَيْرٌ, that to make amends is better. So he reflects on these verses from the Quran. He consults his sheikh, he consults his parents, and they say, you know what, I think, son, you may have made a mistake. I think perhaps maybe there's some room for reconciliation. We'll bring someone from their family and someone from our family. We'll have the scholar, we'll have the therapist. We'll make this, we'll discuss this. Let's not make an irrational decision. Now, it requires a lot of effort, energy, and motivation to want to do that. But let's just say that's the situation. And that individual, that man, he doesn't know how to resolve the situation. So he does what he can. In that moment, if he accepts the support, he's allowed himself the door to go back to his wife and his family, his children, to reconcile and to keep the marriage alive. But when you shut that door by offering 3 divorces at one time, you've closed that door indefinitely. And what that does is, even if then you come back to it and you reflect and come to your senses, the only thing that you're going to be left with is regret. And that's very difficult. It's a very difficult thing to come to terms with. But there are many people in our communities that are living with that pain. They're living with that. And again, if you ask me, I'd say a lot of that has to do with education. And sometimes people actually ask me, well, when do you talk about this all the time, education. I offer a discussion on divorce in premarital counseling. This has been my habit for the past 6 years. People are learning to get married, always ask me, why are we discussing divorce when instead we should be discussing things that should be bringing us together? And I explained to them this exact point, that there are many things that maybe we don't know and we're not aware of. We need to understand those things, right? Like offering one divorce as opposed to 3 divorces, the idea that you can't get your wife back after those 3, right? There are all these challenges that come with it as a result. You don't want to live with that. It's better to be educated now. You learn to refrain. You learn to utilize other resources if need be. We discuss the divorce options for the woman. We discuss, the divorce route from the man, just so that it's clear and it's on the table.
Yeah,
And then
it's kind of like when you're on an airplane, they'll go through, if there's going to be an emergency situation, these are the exits, and this is your oxygen mask, etc. Because you don't want it, you hope it's not going to happen, but it might happen. Right.
Absolutely. And again, I think the most important thing to do in all our marriages and with the community is partnering up with all of our community members and community resources to ensure that the education piece of it is there. And I think sometimes we also tend to think this is only for older adults, maybe folks who have graduated college or something like that. And in my opinion, honestly, I think that the reality is that we need to start having these conversations, maybe not in as much detail, but at least opening up this dialogue for students as for people in the community as young as high school. I don't think that that's far-fetched. There's nothing about the nikah, there's nothing about marriage that is so odd or sensitive that you can't bring up to younger adults, and at least allowing the opportunity for them to reframe the way they view marriage. Your marriages don't have to be the way that your parents' marriages were, right? Sometimes people go through difficult parents. They go through difficult upbringings as a result of their parents' relationship. So the reality is that you don't have to be that exact way. You don't have to grow up or grow into the person that you saw your whole life. And I've worked with young adults who have confessed to me and spoken to me about this and the pain that they felt, thinking genuinely that they're doomed to the fate of their father, or they're doomed to the fate of their uncle, who they grew up with experiencing, maybe not the best marriages. And so just educating and allowing our younger members of community, our younger adults, that freedom, actually, that liberty to learn about this and to give them that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. But a lot of these people, men and women who enter into their marriages, they, especially under stressful situations, end up emulating the parental model unconsciously. So would you suggest that there would be ongoing support, mental health support, because transformation doesn't happen from, a class here or there, right? It's ongoing.
Absolutely.
To undo things that you saw since you were a child, right?
Absolutely. And the idea here is that my point is that we can start at that age,
Mm-hmm.
right? Nothing about ending, but starting as early as high school, in my opinion, allows the education, or like the understanding of what a successful marriage looks like, allows that to start to proliferate into the lives of those young adults, so that as they then go into their college age, that's the age generally people are thinking about marriage, now thinking about that next stage in their lives. Now they'll start to remember what they learned in high school. Then we have continual education in whatever capacity we can, through the masajid, through our community centers, through the programs that we offer within the Muslim community. But the idea being is that, we continue the education. It's there. It's always there. So it follows them from high school to college to post-college life, working, young professionals, that it's always there. It follows them, so that they are not bound to necessarily following in their parental systems of parenting and what they experienced in terms of how the marriages of the parents were. The reality is that when you have an opportunity to reframe the way you grew up, or at least the way you view marriage, oftentimes, especially if it was traumatic or difficult or really, really challenging, oftentimes people don't want to repeat that. People don't want to live through that again. They'll identify for themselves, or they have a little bit of direction from a guidance counselor, a scholar, someone else. They'll read a story, they'll hear a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ kana fi mihnati ahlihi, that he used to take care of the resources of the home. He used to mend his own clothing and take care of his own things that he needed to at the home. These are things that people need to know. And so if you know that that's men can do that, it's okay to help your wife around the house. It's okay for a woman to, to take care of her home and all sorts of responsibilities that exist. If it's fair, it's mutual. It may not exist in your home, but when you know that the Prophet ﷺ, and this is like what it means to have good character, what it means to be good to your family, the responsibilities there, it allows your mind to start processing that and to function in such a way that you can allow yourself to get to that point eventually. And it's entirely shocking when you speak to people and you speak to them about these points about, helping out around the house or helping out your family, being the man of the home. What does that entail in terms of responsibility, not just income that you earn, but also your emotional awareness, your ability to connect with your family. These are things that make a good husband. They make a real man. How many people don't know that? How many people are unaware of that? So I think starting young, starting soon, starting earlier allows just that opportunity for growth.
Absolutely. And at the same time, I think it's incredible and so much needed for men to have this education, because with many cultural rearing, men are not contributing, helping out in the household. But at the same time, I would also argue from my experiences that women also need some education, that it's not weak to be, for example, bashful or shy or to receive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because we've also been very much conditioned by, contemporary culture about, maybe distortions of femininity and womanhood as well, right? But that's probably
absolutely. And I think that just to briefly touch on that, I think this is another one of those things that require open and honest conversation. And I think that maybe it'll be more effective if a woman spoke to young women and a man spoke to young men, just to reach their audience more in a fashion or in a way that aligns with them more in the shared experience department. But I think that definitely this conversation needs to happen. The idea that what does it mean to be a man? And I was sharing with you earlier that, through Wasilah, we have these programs called the Art of Prophetic Manliness, where there are various programs and workshops that we offer that deal with the physical aspects, the mental health aspects, and the spiritual aspects of what it means to be a man in light of the prophetic example. What did the Prophet ﷺ display when it comes to sheer physical strength, right? Very famous incidents of him toppling like the most undefeated Arab wrestler, and then defeating him, and then also sharing in another hadith later that to be strong doesn't mean that you're the one who can topple another person. So we learn in the life example of the Prophet ﷺ that on one hand, yes, he was physically strong. He could topple a wrestler. At the same time, he said that's not real strength. Real strength is having patience when a calamity afflicts a person. إنما الصبر عند صدمة الأولى. That, or for example, that ليس الشديد بالسرعة, that the strong person is not the one who can wrestle the other person, but is that person who knows how to swallow his anger at the time of being completely overwhelmed. So we learn these things from the prophetic example, tying them together and saying, okay, that's what it means to be physically strong. It's not just physically strong in the sense that I can wrestle, but physically strong in the sense that I can identify when I'm like losing it, and I need to control that, and I need to put that in its place. At the same time, for women, for someone to communicate to them that what it means to be a woman is all these beautiful qualities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already blessed you with naturally, organically, to embody that. There's no shame in that. There is no honor in a woman being a man, and there's no honor in a man being a woman. Allah made us different to recognize our differences, to glorify Allah for those differences. Because through those differences, we recognize each other, and we ultimately recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, the idea is that men, of course, need to learn to be men. Women need to learn to be women. And this is sort of what allows our society to function in a very, form follows function, in a system where when we recognize who we are and our roles in the family unit, in the family structure, then things tend to just really fall into place. But unfortunately, due to modernization and all sorts of ambiguous ideas out there, we tend to really get confused. And then we're thinking, well, why am I unhappy? Why am I so unsuccessful? Why am I going through all this turmoil and I'm not really getting what I want out of all this? Maybe because you're not doing things as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, designated for us, or how we should function in a way that follows the prophetic principles.
Okay, and so you mentioned in our discussion that part of the workshop you discuss the civil divorce versus the Shari'i divorce, according to the Sharia.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a very interesting one. So amongst scholars, there's a bit of a difference of opinion here with regards to whether or not an Islamic divorce is needed separately from a civil divorce. And just to clarify those terms even more, a civil divorce is when you both file, or when one person files for a divorce from the other person, and then they are sent the documents that they have to then come to court, sign the documentation for the divorce. Now, oftentimes the concern is, or the complaint is that the man who is served these divorce papers doesn't actually agree to offer the divorce. But because he is legally mandated to now show up in court, there's nothing he can do other than sign it and submit it and to turn it in. So, and the reality is that at least in California, you pay the fees, whatever it is, $200, $300, $400. You apply for a divorce, the divorce happens, and then the other person is served, and there's not really much you can say. Whereas we recognize in the Sharia that the haqq and the right of the divorce is the right of the man. Now, while there is still an opportunity for the woman to seek her own divorce, there are other methods for a woman to seek the divorce. It is not within the Sharia that she can just go and ask for a piece of paper that the courts will mandate that the husband sign, and that automatically equates to a divorce. So all I'm saying is that there's a difference of opinion amongst scholars on whether or not a civil divorce counts in the same light as an Islamic divorce. Now, I will mention this, that here in the Bay Area in California, it is the official opinion of our Islamic Sharia Council that a civil divorce will count as the Islamic divorce. Of course, after the case is assessed, the group of scholars review the case, oftentimes taking between 6 months to 12 months, sometimes, to review the case thoroughly. And even that process is not something which is done so quickly and kind of just left to one person. It's usually a topic that a person presents their case. It's discussed amongst a group of scholars. The entire Sharia Council consists of nearly 100 plus scholars. But in each meeting, we have oftentimes between 40 to 70 scholars that are present discussing one person's case quarterly. And so and then of course a scholar is assigned to continue to learn or look into the case on a weekly basis. So there's a lot of deliberation that goes into it. However, at the end of the day, when the decision is made and that civil divorce is submitted and the other person is served, our Islamic Sharia Council will consider that as an Islamic official divorce. That being said, it's important to also recognize that there may be local scholars, or they may be scholars, or that even within the relationship may be this awareness or this difference of opinion that exists. So I would just suggest that consult with your local scholars, consult with your local mufti and ulama to understand this situation for your specific case. But yeah, and it's important to know that, because you might be blindsided by something like this. Maybe you never heard of it before, or someone else presented that to you and said, yeah, this is, I don't accept civil divorces. So even though I'm signing on this paper, I just want to let you know that I myself have not given you permission. I have not accepted this divorce document that you're giving. And
But
that's
if it's the husband who is doing that, going through the court system, and so he's actually initiating it, then that would be binding.
Absolutely.
Right, because he's the one who's it's like saying, I release you.
Exactly. It would be tantamount to him saying it from like the traditional Islamic point of view.
Right, I see. Okay. Would you like to go on and talk about the mahr?
Yeah, so, and that's another one of those contentious topics, right? So the idea here being that when we talk about divorce, another one of those maybe side topics that come up is, well, if I get divorced, then I'm not going to pay the mahr. Or some of the other things is, when you get married, you don't give the mahr. And oftentimes people use the mahr as a security safety deposit plan, as like a retroactive alimony plan, which is sort of like, okay, here's X amount of money we had agreed upon, but I won't give it to you until we get divorced. So there is some difference of opinion here amongst scholarly works. on, so there's a concept in giving the mahar in the law, in the books of law that mention there's a mahar that's given mu'ajjal, which is given sort of immediately on demand on, upon the completion or within a couple of days. So you give the mahar right away. And then there is mu'ajjal or mu'akhar, which is that mahar which is delayed or deferred.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is an acceptable method of offering the mahar at a deferred time. But sometimes people take that and they do a little bit of injustice with it. So it's important to understand that giving the mahar is wajib. The man has to give a mahar. There's no escaping that, first and foremost. Now, the mahar can be anything. It could be anything of value, right? You can say my mahar is going to be a Hajj trip or an Umrah trip or a brand new car, or, it could be of anything of real value. However, the man has to give the mahar. The other thing is also the mahar is not just a gift. The mahar is not just, something that's just like a simple exchange. You can't ask for it back. Absolutely not. The mahar is the haqq and the right of the woman to be with you intimately. So when you are giving that, that is her agreement that she has agreed now to be with you. And so as a result, now you cannot take that back from her. So this is a recognition that the religion offers the woman. Now, I should also clarify further that the amount, the dollar amount, does not represent the value of the woman. So let that also be clear, that because a person can only offer, a brand new iPhone as mahar, in no way, shape, or form is this misunderstood to mean my daughter, my niece, my sister is worth a brand new iPhone, for example. And culturally, unfortunately, this is exactly what actually how it's interpreted. Just maybe not so ironically, 2 weeks back, I performed the nikah of someone, and the standoff, the mahar standoff lasted over an hour and a half, and it was deciding on how much they were going to agree upon. And this exact statement was uttered, which was, my daughter's not worth her, you're valuing my daughter at $5,000. She's at least $10,000. I'm like, that's terrible.
It sounds like an auction.
It sounds like an auction. That's right. It sounds like an auction, and you're saying the wrong things here. This is not the idea that it's my daughter value. Your daughter is priceless. She's priceless. Every person is priceless.
She's not a commodity.
That's right. And so the understanding here should be that this mahar is what she is happy accepting for the sake of the engaging in this marriage and engaging in this relationship. That's all that it is. So again, the point is that it's her right, it's her haqq that she should be afforded a mahar. And then the other thing that I'll mention is that this is not something that you can take back. Unfortunately, in many cultures, this is something which is practiced, which is that upon divorce, the mahar is given to the woman, and then the mahar is requested back. And this is completely incorrect. Similarly, it should be noted that there are hadith prohibiting that a person should give you a gift and then you ask for that gift back. The Prophet ﷺ mentions that is tantamount to a dog vomiting and then licking up its own vomit. How vile it is that you offer someone a gift. You give a woman jewelry, you give a woman clothing, you give a woman whatever it is. The family is, the husband, whoever gives her gifts. And then upon the divorce, or, there's some conflict or whatever, and they ask for those gifts back. So just, unawareness in this area.
But that can be totally manipulated, because, for example, say he says, I'll give you a car as your mahar mu'ajjal, your deferred mahar. And then the marriage goes downhill and he doesn't want to give a divorce because he knows that he's going to have to provide this delayed mahar. And then she might feel cornered and say, okay, well, I'll just do a khul'a. And so I'll basically, forfeit my mahar so that I can get out of the marriage. And it's like, yes, this is exactly what I wanted. So that can be
absolutely. So just to address that point as well, I think deception in all sorts is absolutely incorrect. There are ways that people will corner people, take advantage of people's vulnerabilities. But remember, this is complete dhulm, and dhulm is the type of sin you don't want to stand before Allah with on your shoulders. That's the thing. You know, and this is a sad reality that oftentimes people don't get closure from some of their marriages. The one that had taken place, the guy got away with it. The woman got away with it. She committed X amount of atrocities towards me, but she got away with it. The reality is that no one gets away with it. This is the truth. Maybe in this dunya, the laws favored the woman. Maybe in this dunya, the laws favored the man. In whatever capacity, it's very important to understand, as Muslims, our aqidah demands, our belief in Allah demands that that person didn't get away with it. That why? Don't think that Allah mentions in the Quran, don't think that Allah is unmindful of the actions of the oppressor. Allah will certainly take that person into account. We have to acknowledge that and understand that and use that as our reconciliation or even our own form of consolement if we feel like we are unable to receive our rights in this very dunya, in this very world. And I understand that that's requires a lot of patience and forbearance to be able to make that your reality. But the truth is that it's very important to understand that, you know, if someone puts a person in that unfortunate corner, you should do what you have to do to fulfill your rights. Now, you mentioned khula. So, you know, I wasn't going to mention it, but you mentioned it anyway. So a khula should also be understood that it's considered a financial buyout. It's considered an agreement. Even if you forfeit your mahar amount, you can settle on another financial agreement, right? Now, unfortunately, it comes on her end. It may come on her end that, listen, I'll offer you X amount of money, or I'll make some agreement with you, and then I want you to give me my divorce. And he will agree to that. And then the moment the exchange is complete, she's offered her freedom back and her liberty to be an independent woman. That is an option. Unfortunately, it puts the stress back on her, right? So yes, you lose. And I don't want to say that she loses her mahar because it's still wajib on the man to give it to her. But for example, if she were to say in lieu, and that was the example you were giving, in lieu of the financial agreement that you owe me, I forfeit that, and on those terms, give me my divorce. And so then he agrees, and then yes, now she loses her mahar. The other option, of course, is fasq. And fasq is what I had mentioned earlier, which is coming to like a court, an Islamic court.
The Muslim judicial body.
Absolutely. And now, obviously, we don't live in a Muslim country. So these court systems, like we have the Islamic Sharia Council, 150 plus or 100 plus scholars, come together, deliberate a case, reach all sides, and then come to a unanimous agreement. This can nullify the marriage as well. Now, the process may be a little bit longer, but the reality is the woman still has that opportunity to seek her rights and to get the fulfillment of her rights from an Islamic body, with, of course, whatever, you know, the case may be for her in that situation.
I'm just going to ask a very frank question, because a lot of women have this question, is that it just seems really hard for a woman, you know, like a man, whether he's a good man or a bad man, at whim, just like that, can make a decision. But as a woman who's seeking a divorce, and I've seen this many times, and I know someone in South Africa who it took her 3 years to get a fasq for her marriage, and she was in an abusive marriage, and no one wanted to give it to her because her husband was somebody who was a Quran, he was a qari, and of his stature in the community. And she had to suffer tremendously until eventually one person stood up for her and said, listen, I'm going to help you get this. And like, it does it have to be that difficult?
It doesn't. And I would say that I fully acknowledge and understand that this process can be incredibly challenging for many women, especially in women who are going through very difficult situations. And the reason why I say this is because, you know, it has not been very easy historically for women, I think, in America in particular, to get their rights fulfilled in that fashion. And to my knowledge, it's getting better. And I can only speak to my community and the group of scholars that I'm associated with. And I praise the great work that they do, because in understanding the Sharia, there's so much room for mercy, so much room for understanding, and allowing a person to voice their concerns, allowing them to voice their, you know, suffering, their frustrations that they're experiencing, and to be heard. Because that's another big element of this, which unfortunately oftentimes does happen, where the case is not even heard. The story is not even given an opportunity to see the light of day. And so as a result, having these communities, and mashallah, a lot of scholars have now in their own localities, in most metropolitan cities, they have a body of scholars. There's a great deal of resources now available to men and women for mediation, for supportive services, for therapy, for reunification, and then ultimately for divorce as well. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has stipulated in Allah's divine wisdom as the rights of man versus the rights of woman, we don't question those commandments, but what we do is we learn to navigate them in a way that's amicable as best as possible and what's within our capacity. And I think the more, the community, the scholars, the therapists, all those working professionals, the more we work together, the more there's a mutual understanding. I think we find that things are getting to a place where they haven't been historically, which is in a much more positive way. I think it's become more open. Although I still acknowledge fully that there are a tremendous amount of people who still struggle to get their voice heard. And even till this very day, like, I only offer therapy services in California, but it is not uncommon for me to get requests all over the country, from Florida, from New York, New Jersey. I've received requests from New Mexico, Washington, just all over the country for this specific thing. And if I may, it's kind of like a selfish plug here, but we actually offer through Wasilah a professional religious consultation service. And I think the reason why this is so important is because through these consultation services, you get a chance to sit with me or another scholar and share what's going on. So number one, the education piece is present, but number two, also you get resources. So for example, if you feel like I'm in a situation where I don't know what to do next, whether I'm supposed to seek a divorce, whether I'm supposed to try to find reunification or therapy or therapist, and I don't know what to do, when you make that appointment, when you make that consultation service, you end up having the opportunity to connect to someone who's connected to others. And in particular, when you're connected with scholars, usually scholars have a very broad network to provide you those resources. And so alhamdulillah, having scholars that are very privy to the world of mental health, scholars who are very understanding of the needs and the concerns of our community, these professional religious consultations are an invaluable asset to the entire community. And I will mention that while therapy services are offered specifically to people who are in California, the religious consultation is open to anyone nationwide or even international.
Yes, and I'm so glad you did mention that, because I believe that you also have a sliding scale, right?
That's right. That's right.
That's a very, very useful resource for our community. Thank you so much. Would you like to talk about the gender dynamics?
Yeah, certainly. And this is one of those discussions where I've spoken about this on Jummah khutbahs, and I've spoken to this topic to men separately, to women separately, to university students, to all populations, really. I think what's a very sort of popular trend right now is this over or hyper masculinity from many men in particular, where they try to be masculine or they try to be men, but they've completely skewed the understanding of what that means. And of course, we have to always mention that this has to be done as Muslims from a prophetic lens. You cannot be a man if you're doing things opposite to what the Prophet ﷺ was doing. There is no more manly man than him. That's our belief. And so when you look at his life and your lifestyle is different than that, then you cannot really be a true man in both the spiritual sense of the word, but also in every other capacity. And the idea is that oftentimes men and women function in such a way, especially in the West in particular, that they are empowered and emboldened to act in whatever way that they want. And this is a very humanistic approach to the world, that my feelings matter more than anything else. My emotions matter more than everyone else. It's all about me. I need my personal pleasure. I need my personal goals to be achieved. And it leaves no room, first and foremost, for anybody else. But also what is inadvertently happening is that we're also pushing God out of the equation. We're pushing Allah out of the equation. And as Muslims, it should be said that our view of the world, the way we view the world, the way we do things, the way we function, the way we do everything is God-centric and not human-centric. It's God-centric. Why? Because at the end of the day, this world is a prison for the believers. Ad-dunya sijnul mu'min wa jannatul kafir. If we can acknowledge that this world is a prison for the believer, then that means that you don't get everything that you want. You get what the warden gives you. You get what you're given, and that's it. So that being said, going back to this original idea that oftentimes, gender norms or practices in relationships, they butt heads quite a bit. There are clashes about what does it mean to be a man, what does it mean to be a woman. I will say to a degree there's an area of subjectivity here. It's a bit more subjective than we tend to think. It's not just one very specific direction. Men are like this and women are like this. What we know is that there are guidelines by which we live our lives. That the Prophet ﷺ says, وَالرَّجُلُ رَاعٍ فِي أَهْلِ بَيْتِهِ, that a man is responsible for his home. وَالْمَرْأَةُ رَاعِيَةٌ فِي بَيْتِ زَوْجِهَا, and a woman is responsible for the home of her husband. So these are guidelines. What that looks like, what the manifestation of that looks like, what does that practice look like? In my understanding is that so long as all the rights are being fulfilled between husband and wife, whatever the two of you agree upon, that will both make your marriage successful, but it'll also get you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Perhaps it may not be in the very traditional nuclear family, traditional gender norms that the man is the single breadwinner and the woman is a homemaker, raising children, raising the family, etc. For some people, that is what a successful marriage looks like. But for other people, it's just not feasible. Maybe it requires a two-income home. Two breadwinners is required, and then the roles and responsibilities of the home are managed separately. Maybe that's what the two of you have agreed upon. But see, here's the thing: unless there's that open communication, open dialogue, open discussion, and ability to be, open to the idea of having this conversation and actually compromising where you feel like I can't do this or she can't do that. If you're a complete and total mismatch, this is where we understand the concept of kufu or kafa'a, which is compatibility. And this is applicable before you get married. This is why it's a concept in our tradition. This is why the Prophet ﷺ said to marry someone who you have compatibility with. Why? Because the more things you are compatible with before marriage, the less conflict you'll have in marriage. And it all just makes sense. And like I said in the beginning, when we tend to do things on our own, not really following the deen, not really following the prophetic example, it's like a person, I wear glasses, and because this is just right in front of me, I can not wear glasses. But if I'm in public, I can't see 10 feet in front of me, And the idea is that why? I'll be misguided. I'll be confused. So I need those glasses to be guided and to get a sense of direction. That sense of direction in our marriages, in our lives, is when we wear those glasses. One lens is the Quran, the other is the Sunnah. When you wear that, then you have complete guidance in your life, in everything. So you realize that my marriage, if I want a successful marriage, I got to wear the lens of Quran and Sunnah. If I want a successful job, if I want to be a successful husband, if I want to be a successful father, anything that you can think of that you want to be the best at, there is a road that's been paved already for us. So ultimately, going back to this discussion on gender roles and what each person should do, we should recognize that, first and foremost, find compatibility with one another. Then whatever you decide will be those roles. Many people consider helping around the house to be a feminine trait, a feminine quality. Sewing your own clothes is considered feminine traits. But the Prophet ﷺ did it. He took care of the home. He sewed his own clothing. He would race with his wives for fun. All of this shows that there is more to being a man than we tend to think. And that the women, right, are emotionally intelligent. They're aware of the needs of their husbands. So they can recognize that, identify that, and act on that. And maybe, I don't know, maybe we'll end on this story, but there's a very beautiful example of this emotional intelligence on the side of the woman, on the side of the wife, in the example of Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha during the Battle of Mu'tah. In the Battle of Mu'tah, the Prophet ﷺ lost 3 of his closest companions. They were supposed to be flag bearers, literally. They were supposed to hold the flag of Islam during the battle. And what ended up happening, right, is that all 3 of those Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum became martyred in the order in which he told them, first you, then you, then you. When the Prophet ﷺ received the news that they had passed away and became shaheed, he was in the masjid. And the wording of the athar, the wording of this hadith mentions, وَيُعْرَفُ فِي وَجْهِهِ الْحُزْنِ. And that Aisha was the one narrating this hadith. She says, I saw that the Prophet ﷺ was sitting in the masjid when the news reached him about the passing away and the death of his companions. And she said that I was able to identify that from his face, you could recognize the grief and the sadness as the tears were rolling down. Why this is such an important hadith? Because it shows that she saw what her husband needed and left him to it. She did not try to enforce what she thought was necessary or what she wanted to do. She knew that for him, in that moment, his comfort was staying in the masjid and staying in his grief and staying exactly where he was, surrounded by his other Sahaba. So while she saw this and is narrating this, it does not mention that she went and then did something about it. She knew, and that was her emotional intelligence and her awareness to identify, what does my husband need of me? And I will do that thing. So extrapolating off that hadith, we recognize that this is not something which is specific to women, obviously. Emotional intelligence, men and women can both have it. But in that moment, it showed how that wife, shared that moment with her husband. So, ultimately, when we talk about gender norms and gender relations, it's what the two of you make of it. But the reality is you have to get to that point of being able to make it something. And it usually starts with that compatibility from the beginning and from the get-go. So I hope that makes sense. And it's a very nuanced discussion and topic. So definitely so much more can be said, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. This was a very informative discussion, and I will include the link to the Wasilah Connections website where people may be able to access your workshop and the counseling services, inshallah. And I would really love to continue this discussion on other topics in the near future, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure. So thank you for having me. Jazakumullah khairan.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.